And now we get to slip right into the Sunday talk today. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. Some of you were here last week for my talk, Looking for Love. And I, at the time, didn't quite know that I was going to be here this week. So now I've got Looking for Love Part 2, because you may have felt a little bit left in the lurch. But today I'm going to bring up to speed those of you that weren't here fairly quickly, and then we'll expand on what we talked about last week. So what we talked about last week was agape, which is the Greek word for love, and that we decided that love means to value or to hold someone in generous concern. And so we looked at what are the characteristics of being valued? How do we know when we feel valued? And I came up with 4 characteristics, and those are valued for all of who you are, so comprehensively, valued unwaveringly, so consistently, valued without conditions, purely, and valued unendingly, eternally. And then we started looking at where do we find value? Where do we find those 4 conditions in our world? And I invited you to think about all of your experiences and whether you found all 4 of those conditions in any kind of relationship you have in the physical world. So we looked at given family. And, you know, we've all got stories about our families and the experiences we've had, and that in some ways, one of those 4 values probably isn't apparent all the time in our given family. So then we looked at chosen family. Friends, spouses, in-laws, pets. I think I was speaking, but I think we collectively decided that pets do a good job of most of those except the eternal part, because they've got a shorter lifespan than we do. But other than that, they do a pretty good job. So then we turned inside and looked at, well, do we find agape when we look in the mirror? And most of us, I think, agreed that we're not very consistent with that. It's a tough place to find that love. And I left you with a question: are you safe walking the hallways of your mind? And that's a place to start with. How do we move out of where we are and find the love that we're looking for? So then we turn to, can we find love through source or principle? And we answered those 4 questions. Comprehensive? Yeah. Consistent? Absolutely. Pure? Yes. Eternal? Yes. Whoops, there we go. So here's where we jump off from last week and talk about new things. So when we look for love in the wrong places, we're looking in places in this box. We look to ourselves, we look to chosen family, given family, all around. When we look that way, then we're forgetting that we're surrounded by source. Source is all around us. And so if we can't find agape in our earthly relationships, then let's narrow it down and let's just look at how do I find that agape, that unconditional love that I look for, as we all do. So we'll narrow it down to just each of us for a few moments here. So the first step is you recognize that, or believe that Source is everywhere at all times. That's the first step in finding the love that we want and deserve. And in the New Testament, we have the New Testament passage where the apostle talks about Source being in him, for in him we live, move, and have our being. Everywhere, all the time. And so what we end up having is, when we start down this path of believing that God is everywhere at all times, we have Source all around us, right? So this is what we had last week. I want to add one more element here because we missed it last week, or at least I did. And that is, Source is everywhere. Source is ubiquitous. It's one of my favorite words. I taught it to my daughter when she was 3, and she was telling people, bugs are ubiquitous in Florida. And they were just laughing their heads off. They were like, how does she know that word? So, is Source ubiquitous? Absolutely. Source is everywhere. So, what we end up doing, though, is we think it's everywhere outside of us, right? This isn't yellow. And we often create a pretty serious boundary around our identity and Source. And that's how we start step 2, which is to invite Source into your heart. If Source is out there, then we've got to do something to get out there or to reach Source. If Source is everywhere, then Source is all through us too. But we don't realize that, or we don't live into that. So the first step is to invite Source in. As humans, we've developed this amazing capacity to lock out Source. We can keep Source out of our energetic field to our detriment, but we can do it. You know, we can set that boundary. Or we can say yes to Source. And how do we do that? See if I'm flipping the right way here. Well, Unity teaches us that there's several ways to do it, but they're all similar. One is through prayer. We make a conscious attempt to get quiet and allow Source to come into our lives, to come into our hearts. Meditation is another aspect or another method of bringing Source into our energetic field. And sacred scripture, studying sacred scripture, something that inspires us, that reminds us of who we are, that we're the offspring of God. The thing that's consistent about all three of those methods is you aren't looking out to other people for this. It's all about solitude. It's all about finding space where you can quiet your mind down so that you can hear your heart. And then God begins to infuse your heart and to fill it with joy and power and love, all of that. So what happens after that is you get full of Source, right? So it's not a boundary there, it's now the equivalent. And then what happens after that is your boundary starts to dissolve a little bit. You're not separate and apart as much. You're part of everything. You're part of Source. We're living in that space. So then, the next step, step number 3, begin to see Source in everything all the time. That's my kind of interpretation of Christ consciousness, is seeing Source in everything all the time. That's what Source does. Source sees its offspring and its manifestation as just part of what's created, part of who it is, right? So, how do we do that? Well, then we start not only allowing Source in, we start seeing Source without. So arrows both ways in our being. So then step 4 is to live this Christ consciousness in all of life. Again, we're allowing Source in. We're looking out into the world and seeing Source, seeing the beauty of the consciousness of everything around us. And then we can start treating our given family with the love that we are. Some of them may be easier than others. I know my siblings probably think I'm one of the harder ones in the family. We start seeing our chosen family through the eyes of love. And again, we may have to retreat to that solitude on a regular basis to fill ourselves up so that we can move out into the world and become that love that God created us to be. And then we start seeing strangers as part of God's love, as part of Source. All of creation, see all of the beauty around us, from the things that we think are safe and beautiful like a butterfly, to the things that we're afraid of in the creation. Snakes or whatever, kind of fear has been instilled in you about the natural world. And then enemies and the unknown. All of those become permeated through our work and through our eyes into the world as part of the love that manifested the world. So, sometimes our enemies have what used to be our consciousness, which is we're separate and apart from all that is, right? So that's why the one thing that we know Jesus said in the New Testament, absolutely, without a question, that's of all the things he said, there's one thing that Jesus said that all of the scholars agree was probably came out of his mouth. Love your enemies. So that's how we get to Christ's call for us to become the love that we are in the world. That's how we look for love, find love, and become love. Thank you.